some of what we spoke about last week concerning basic structural research. Then I'm going to go on to compare and contrast experimental research and quasi-experimental research. I want you to know the basic features of these two types of approaches to research. And I have posted a couple of articles that I hope you saw. I posted it a bit late, so I hope you've had a chance to look through it. But if you've not, please over the next week look through those articles that I posted and that I'll be speaking about. We're going to be looking at those over time as we develop, as we look at validity and the designing of research. Those two articles we're going to kind of focus on to come to some understandings. But again, I started out with talking about structural and basic research because in our field of speech-language pathology, we're still learning about language and speech and cultures. And therefore, we are still engaged with basic research. What's the purpose of basic research? To discover and identify things belonging to an area of study. And for example, dinosaurs, syntactic components of sentences, burial practices in novel cultures, semantic relations in children's language. Again, cutting across different areas of specialization: archaeology, anthropology, linguistics, speech-language pathology. Each area has a basic research component. And in a complex area such as speech and language, that basic research component is critical because until we identify the things that belong to an area of study, that is speech and language, we can't ultimately act to control it. We can't control what we don't know exists. Another purpose of basic research, and particularly structural basic research, is to describe stages in the development of a behavioral system. Okay, now, what are the dependent variables in basic structural research? Number one, observable, measurable patterns of behavior. Observable physical structures. Attributes of behaviors or physical structures. Relationships between behaviors and or physical structures. And variations and changes over time in patterns of behavior as individuals develop. Now, what are the independent variables in basic structural research? They are, on one hand, engagement in a task, because last week we looked at, remember, the Tower of Hanoi task, and we see that that engagement in tasks such as this, or in engagements of individuals in interactions, are seen as causal, that is, contributing to development through one process or another. Another component or independent variable in basic structural research concern units of organization within the mind or other behavioral, physiological, or neurological systems, or within a family, hierarchy of species or cultures. Again, units of organization that can exist within the mind, within other behavioral, physiologic, or neurological systems, or within a family or hierarchy of species or cultures. What do we mean by, what are examples of units of organization? Things like, in our field, that we have, you and I have explored in, or are exploring in language acquisition, we're looking at content categories, which are the way ideas are organized, at least according to Lois Bloom. Phrase structure and sentence, which have to do with the way sentences are organized. And it all depends on the field that the basic structural research is occurring, as to whether these units of organization occur within the mind or in a behavioral, physiologic, or neurologic system, or within a family or hierarchy of species or cultures. Now, in our field, units of these content categories, syntactic structures, pragmatic functions, etc., exist in behavior. They're seen to be generated from the mind and thus exist in the mind, which is a neurologic system. They're also seen as existing within culture. So that's what essentially these are the things that are seen as causal in structural research, basic structural research, and the outcome of these causes is behaviors such as language or cognition, or components of language such as semantics, pragmatics, syntax, etc. Now, what is the methodology of basic structural research? Well, search and dig. If you remember the dinosaur study I pointed out. Observe individuals engaged in self-directed or communal problem-solving routines or other naturalistic behaviors over time, as when you're engaged in a Piagetian task such as the Tower of Hanoi, or when children are engaged in play or interactions with their parents or other naturalistic experiences. You observe, and then you record behavior. You describe everything that participants do, as you're doing in the language samples that you're taking in the language acquisition course. You microanalyze behavior observed. That is, you look at every little bit of behavior and try to ask yourself, what are there patterns here? Because that's another aspect of methodologies, identification of patterns, and try to understand and try to then use the behaviors, or the little teeny behaviors that you observe, to reach an understanding about these patterns. Now, what do I mean by reach an understanding? Well, you analyze patterns with reference to relevant structural or developmental research that was done in the past. Before you do your research, you go back and look at the research that's done before, and typically you'll find something that was done that relates to what you're planning to do yourself. And often, for example, when Lois, again, as I believe I spoke about last week, when Bloom was working to discover her content categories, she had the work of Piaget and Chomsky to work off of. Chomsky very much related to the SVC focus in her, the verb relation focus in her taxonomy, and Piaget in terms of his stages and ultimately the types of content categories that the types of idea patterns that she was looking for and ultimately identified in children. And then once you start, it's almost impossible not to start with an already discovered developmental taxonomy. Once you begin with that, then you have to allow yourself to let it go and allow yourself as a researcher to identify new patterns that may be different from those described in the related research that served as a foundation for your work. And then Part of the research method is to make that we researchers make inferences about underlying mental, social, or biological structures and processes. Again, we view that is about the independent variable that's accounting for, or variables that are accounting for the outcomes that we're describing. In the case of the Hanoi Tower task, the outcome was solving the task. In the case of a language acquisition study, the outcome is a child's language, which is organized around existence, action, locative action, etc., which is organized vis-a-vis sentences, which have subject-verb complement, organization, etc., etc., etc. Incidentally, did any of you try working on the Tower of Hanoi task? That's an example of a task in which we could study the development of cognition, as I mentioned last week, is the kind of thing I do. And if you played around with the task, if you actually practiced it over the week, you have a sense of your experience with this task. So I'd like to just quickly comment on the kinds of things I look for, or I've identified, in research that has looked at tasks such as the Tower of Hanoi. I've never published on the Tower of Hanoi, but we let's pretend that I videotaped you every single day last week performing this particular task, and then each of you, and then I actually transcribed all of your behaviors and all of your comments. Particularly if I had asked you, and which I typically do, I asked individuals as they do these tasks, I say, what are you planning to do before you start? And then I ask why. Why are you planning to do what you're doing? And I do that, I watch individuals work on tasks like this over and over again. I usually observe individuals over 3 weeks during 30-minute sessions per week. And I transcribe every single behavior and every single comment that the individual expresses, and I microanalyze. That is, I look at every little pattern, every little behavior to try to identify patterns. And when I do this kind of research, I have some guidance because I have followed for my entire career the work of Piaget. And Piaget identifies in 4 general stages in the development, cognitive development, which are sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. I basically focus on the first 3, sensory motor, pre-operational, and concrete operational, and use those as a starting point as I look to see if I see patterns in behaviors of individuals as they do these tasks and become expert at them. And as I compare individuals one with the other to see if there's a commonality across individuals as they learn to solve this task or a task like it. I think I posted for you an article that I did along these lines a number of years ago with adults with learning disabilities and board balancing, and another article that involved driving a tractor and a toy tractor and a trailer. Very similar kind of work. Well, let me just say these are the things I've noticed over time. I'm going to say that basically I identify minimally 3 basic stages in the learning, in the development of cognition in context of this Hanoi Tower task. Now, I did post an article by Wansert on the 3-disc tower with children with learning disabilities, and he has has published and has identified similar stages, and so has Alex Blanchet a number of years ago, who was working at the University of Geneva. So if you played around with these things, you'll find that initially it's kind of like cause and effect. It's exploratory in nature how to do this. And of course, the big question is, where do you start first, in the middle or over here? And usually it's, individuals will say, when they initially begin the task, will say, doesn't matter, which already suggests to me a stage. It's part of a pattern that you see across individuals, because it does matter. But so the first stage, I would say, is exploratory, where individuals try different patterns, run into problems, start again, and they become, what they discover though during that first stage, in which there's exploration is you can't try to do all of them at once. You have to set goals for yourself, sub-goals. Remember, the goal of the Tower of Hanoi task is to get to the final post, the target post, whatever that might be. I'm targeting this right-hand post to begin with. Let me angle this for you so you can see it better. So they realize, well, that's a goal, but you have to have other goals. And you start realizing that you've got to somehow clear this the large disk, so that you can get it over here. You have to clear it. So somehow you have to get you have to clear the disk. So that becomes a sub-goal. You don't just get everything over there, you have to somehow clear the disk so that this disk can move, which means you have to get a sub-tower somehow, this set of disks piled up somewhere so that can move. And as you go along, there are even more sub-goals. Then once you get this disk over here, you have to get the next one free, and then the next one, and then the next one. So these are all a set of sub-goals. That's one thing that's discovered. So that gets discovered between the first phase or stage of development, which is exploratory, and the beginning of identification of the sub-goals, and the next stage, which involves knowing the sub-goals, trying to figure out what procedure you use to achieve them in a systematic way. And what finally happens between, let's say, stages 2 and 3 are the construction or representation of other objects, seeing relationships between these disks, so that you move from dealing with 5 separate disks to subunits of disks. And I use the term sub-tower. That gets discovered between the second and third phase, someplace in the development of this, between the second and third phase of development. Sub-towers. That is, you start thinking, well, to get this off here, now I have to get this, and you start thinking in the middle. And to get this in the middle, I first have to clear this. That is the second biggest disk. So to do that is kind of like that 3-disk tower that we started with, in that you can think ahead a little bit. You're working only with these 3. You have to move them up someplace like over here on the side, because if you can move them over here, these 3 disks over here, get rid of them for a while, you see, 3 disks only. Then you can move this in the middle, which was your sub-goal. So really now I have 2 sub-goals. Clear this, get this over there. In order to clear this, I have multiple sub-goals and multiple objects. I have these two disks, and these three disks, this is really one thing. I call it a subtower. Now I'm going to, since I've only got 3 disks to work with, I think I can probably do this. And now my next sub-goal is to move these disks away so that this disk can get into the middle. Again, keeping in mind my sub-goal all along, which is pile the disks up in the middle so that you can clear this one. And now jump it, move it over here. Now it's on its target, and that's a good thing. Again, what's my next sub-goal? Next sub-goal, get this tan one clear so it can move over here. To get the SAM one clear, operate and get this sub-tower over here. It's a 3-disk sub-tower. I have enough, even at my age, I have enough mental capacity and memory to operate with 3 disks. Now what do I have to do? I have to get rid of them. So I'll get rid of them over here by getting, I need to get this one over here. I can work with 3 disks, you see. I can figure that one out. I've taken 5 disks and reduced the 5 to 3, which I move 3 at a time, which I think about at any one time, because I've created a new object called a sub-tower. And that's what you do as you move into phase 3. Create sub-towers, which involve fewer disks, which are a lower and much less of a stress on your memory, a much more systematic way to do it. And now I know, again, now I'm only working with a 2-disk sub-tower, because my goal is to get this over here, and I know for sure I have to get rid of these 2. I'll put them in the middle. And I will ultimately solve the puzzle. You're able to follow that. This is structural research because, and basic research, because it is an effort to first identify components of cognition that are involved in the resolution of a problem and in development. And those components are organization that I identified, the representation of sub-goals, the representation and establishment of sub-goals, and of the representation of objects by making relationships between individual objects so that you have fewer objects to deal with at any one time. So making relationships between objects to create other objects, very similar to relating molecules together to make objects out there in the real world. And identifying sub-goals, so you're not trying to do everything at once and deal with every individual thing at once. That dealing with everything at once tendency that we have, which I think we do not just in the Tower of Hanoi task, but across tasks, I would call that a holistic stage of functioning, where you don't see things, you don't break the task down into its subparts and then identify attributes and sub-goals and specific objects, or create your own objects within the task, but rather you're dealing with the whole task as different pieces, which is a lot of pieces. And that holistic stage is an exploratory stage, or perhaps it's exploratory and then holistic. Then you break it down and start identifying sub-goals and objects that could be, that are within and attributes that are within the material that you're dealing with. And then at the end of the day, you systematically address the task. Now, it's very interesting, by the way. If you played around with this, you may have found that your whole attention sometimes was focused just in one place, and you miss things. You find often that individuals, when you're working on a task like this particular task, there are 3 places where your attention can be. But sometimes it becomes so overwhelming that your eyes literally focus on one and ignore the other places, and you overlook things. But as you develop expertise in the task, as you go through stages of development, you pull back and are able to handle, that is, attend to more than one place at once. I think you'll see this in this task and many tasks. In any event, my goal is not to teach you or hold you to, or require that you know how to address the Hanoi Tower task, how to solve it, or know even the stages that are involved in the solution of it, but experience an approach to research that is, I will call, basic structural developmental research. Now, I don't have time to go any further with this right now, but we deal with a very complex, we're dealing with a very complex field of speech-language pathology, which involves language function, which is mind function, as we've discussed in the language acquisition course. It is the way our mind functions, and therefore there are many components to the behavioral system, as we've spoken: form, content, and use, morphology, phonology, syntax, all that work together, semantics, pragmatics, all that are on one hand individual things and on the other hand work together. There are many, many things that need to be discovered and that we need to know how they work together before we can ever actually act to control them, as we do in clinical research. So this kind of work, which may look very abstract, and you might say to yourself, well, how, the guy's nuts. How does he really know what's going on in anybody's mind? Well, you can't really know that. What you really have to do is look at behavior and describe patterns of behavior. And then the inferences one makes about what goes on in the mind, that's theoretical stuff. And ultimately that is then allows for predictions. Subsequently, if you, for example, if I propose 3 phases in this development, and say one is exploratory and leading to the identification of sub-goals. Number 2 involves representing subunits of the task and identifying attributes of the material that you're manipulating, while still trying to discover the best solution. And level 3, systematically addressing the task with reference to the sub-goals and the units that you have represented. If I identify those stages, I might try to apply them, engage individuals in other problem-solving tasks, or look at number of individuals engaged in this problem-solving task, and I ask myself and others who might want to replicate the study, do these stages and these concepts, constructs, and propositions account for what we see, or are there other explanations? That's basic research in a field like speech-language pathology or cognitive psychology. I'm now going to turn to experimental research and quasi-experimental